This is a Global Energy Network podcast.
Moving on, you obviously, Noble took care and you then moved kind of off the tools into a management role with Noble and Archer. How was that, moving away from the tools and becoming the boss rather than, chatting to the guys in the tea shack? How did that change?
So I was very conscious of the fact that with management comes responsibility for others. And I tried to remember as best as I could, and I think I've done a fairly good job at it, if I say so myself, that it's about keeping connection with the people that are actually out there picking the tools up.
Yeah.
It's really important. So as much as I was a boss that was distant from the workplace, I always tried to fit in offshore visits and get with the crews, and I wouldn't spend time in the offices offshore. I would go down to tea shacks, I'd go sit in the locker rooms, and I think people respected me for that.
Yeah.
And I would genuinely think that I talk about it a lot now, that part of leadership is engagement. Huge part is leadership engagement in doing the right things. And that's what I always tried to do, whether I was in this country or I was in Brazil or Alaska. It didn't matter. I just wanted to make sure I was visible and I was seen as being caring for the people that worked for me.
And see, obviously, kind of, for a health and safety point of view, that's kind of that's a main driver for you, especially what you'd been through and everything else. But when you went to Brazil, for instance, what was the health and safety side like there?
So when we won the contract for the Brazilian drilling contract, we genuinely knew it would be different because we had to have 85% local content in the crews. So I knew if I was going to put expats in, it would have to be people that I really believed could make a change.
Yeah.
Because culturally, you don't ask questions of your boss in Brazil.
Yeah.
Even if you're a middle manager.
What about language there as well? I went to Brazil, went to Rio the other year for a show, and I couldn't even order a fried egg.
Yeah. So we were lucky in many ways that the company we'd won the drilling contracts for were Norwegian. So English was the first language.
Yeah.
Many of our crews certainly weren't English speaking, but we made a conscious decision that managerial positions and as much supervisor positions as we could would have to have English, or were prepared to learn it.
Yeah, I felt quite ignorant. Just, you kind of think everywhere you go, everybody speaks English, and it wasn't until I got there and realised actually like 1 or 2% of Brazilians speak English.
Yeah, and what do you have to do? You have to really try and learn. You don't have to be fluent, but you have to be able to communicate and
because there's a
be
safety
pleasant
aspect there,
and be polite. And I think it all has a safety aspect, but I think, again, what we did there was we did a lot of team building effort combined with the client and our offshore crews. And that's when we really started to bond as a team.
Yeah.
And because we had, I'd say, first line supervisors that were fairly fluent in English, but were Brazilian, it made such a huge difference. And I decided that I'd learn poor Portuguese enough to be able to welcome them, hello, show concern for them, and I think they really appreciated that because I was trying.
And what's the culture like there versus here?
Well, for me, I recognised almost from a get-go when we're just setting up the office and getting it up, that we would have a big challenge, because if you look at the way of life for those folks that you're typically an employer offshore, they scoot about in scooters and motorbikes with t-shirts on and flip-flops.
Yeah.
How do you take that away from them when they go offshore? So we had to do some basic, very basic things in it. But I think because we very, as a result of things like Piper and all that kind of stuff, we have highly developed in this basin.
Yeah.
And I think we've been and done that story. We've raised the bar. So I think it was almost like going back 5-10 years and going, like, where did we start? What's important? Can't talk to them about safety case until you've got them talking about.
You try to introduce the procedures.
And that's what we did. We got fundamentals right first, and we did in the team building. We made sure we had them caring for each other before we thought about asking it to abide by processes that were very technical. And I think we realised that it was more about communicating and allowing them to understand, show and tell, rather than expect them to pick up a document that's been written in second language. And I think we did a good job, but we had a pretty tough start. We had a lot of minor incidents. We had some ones that were sort of fairly serious, lost time incidents, etc. But we didn't let it stop us. We just, and the client was very supportive, very supportive. And we created something called aiming high. And it wasn't like step change, it was just internal at Peregrino, which was Equinor, it wasn't Statoil at the time, but Equinor's business. And we brought all the subcontracting managing directors together.
Okay.
Because we'd seen it work elsewhere.
Yeah.
Because I'd done work with Equinor and Statoil in Norway and in Europe. So I'd seen it work together, and we really built a strong, cohesive team. And we got the managers on board.
Bought in.
And they realised that it was so important to us that they were all talking the same language. We'd go off site with them and all the rest of it. And that really made a difference. And I think one of the insightful things at Statoil then, they did, probably because of my piper experience, people looked at me differently. I maybe didn't see it that way, but it genuinely did. And what Equinor did at the time was they said that it was an Equinor process. Aiming High was an Equinor process at a very high level, and they appointed me as the chair of the Aiming High group, which for a contractor was very unusual.
Yeah.
But they saw that as being a demonstration of putting someone in charge that has felt that experience and is passionate around it.
Do you think coming from like again, being on the tools to a VP level, did you ever look at other sort of senior executive people and think you don't have a fucking clue what is happening? Or had they kind of all progressed through the tools?
Well, so I think that works two ways actually, because certainly now, if I think about my senior years now, I realised that as someone who's came through the technical side, I'd never been a driller.
Yeah.
Never worked a brake, never stripped a mud pump, done the electrical end. I recognised I needed to know, I needed to demonstrate what I didn't know.
Yeah.
And I think because I was humble enough to do that, and I showed humility when I did it, because sometimes I'd walk in the room and go, I'm not here to tell you how you do your jobs, I could never be a driller.
Yeah.
And you get the guards down immediately. And what I did, and I think others appreciate it, was I made sure I surrounded myself with people that are exceptionally competent from an operational standpoint in drilling.
Yeah.
It allowed me to be better at the business side. And something else that Noble Drilling did for me, they put me through an international MBA, which was elevated my strategic and leadership skills immensely. And if you take that in the technical competence, it's a really good pedigree to have when you go through. And I think because I was able to articulate things from a very technical point with crews, maintenance crews, etc., it made a difference. And I think people saw me as someone that they could relate to.
Yeah.
And I've seen bad examples of that.
And how was your time in Brazil and Alaska from a personal point of view?
Very demanding, but I think I've been through the last 37, 38 years almost thinking I'm lucky to be here.
Yeah.
So I should never complain about the demands put on me. And I can try and manage them, and I'm doing that now as an older gentleman. But I find it very difficult not to be almost like a workaholic.
Yeah.
And I'd go to all these places. I mean, if you think about the distance between Alaska and Rio de Janeiro, and I would do that in 3 days.
Yeah.
Just because I was responsible for those operations.
What was the flight time for that?
Can I say it was 11 hours from Houston, I think, to 8 hours from Houston to Rio de Janeiro, and it was another 6 to 7 hours from Houston, Alaska. But
You're doing that on a regular basis?
I've got both in a week.
Yeah.
Because it felt like the right thing to do to build a team.
Yeah.
So travelling was onerous. It was onerous on my family as well. I mean, when we were abroad, thankfully my boys were of the age they weren't with us. But it was onerous for my wife, Mary Ann, because she never knew when I was coming home, and she knew I'd be home for a couple of days.
Yeah.
But we just managed it. We managed it together, But I think if you put the miles in and you put the effort in, people appreciate it.
And for a personal aspect for you and Mary Ann, was it a nice place to live in Rio, or?
The thing that we really didn't, I certainly didn't. So the thing you'll need to understand about Mary Ann and I, Kenny, is I'm a blue sky, white fluffy clouds, big picture person. Mary Ann lives in the detail.
Yeah.
And I think that's how we're so good together. So when I went to Brazil, I was like, yeah, it'll be a cool place to go, get some time off. It'll be a hard task, but it'll be a good transfer. Well, I went in as, not just as an MD, I went in as country manager, which elevated my status, which meant I was pretty high profile.
Yeah.
Effectively a target. And that meant that we had to have a driver all the time and someone that was with us all the time. We could have no spontaneous
Yeah. Could you just decide to
breaks.
go somewhere?
Hey, we'll go down to the restaurant tonight. We had to go and get our ETMR lined up and get us down. And is that going to be okay? Phone ahead. So it became very non-spontaneous.
Yeah.
And after, I think it would have been 8 months down there, we decided we couldn't live in Rio any longer because it was just claustrophobic.
Okay.
So we moved 10 miles out to a place called Baja de Sugar, which was where all the Shell folks lived. We lived in the same compound as them. And that allowed us to wander to the beach and make friends.
A bit more relaxed.
And it was a bit more relaxed. But I think it was pretty tough on Mary Ann because she wasn't going.
Yeah, she wasn't going to work.
No, she did. We ended up finding, we had a project she could work on, giving her skills. And that, or she'd have went back to Houston.
Yeah.
She ended up being responsible for creating a competence system in Brazil, which was game changing.
Yeah.
And so she did that. She learned the language fairly well because she was dealing with what we call the front line almost. So when she got involved in that, she got involved in a social charity, local church for orphans, she was consumed with what was going on.
Yeah.
So it made our time in Brazil enjoyable but bearable. And we would spend time at the weekends away from Rio. We'd go up into the mountains.
Yeah.
So we made the best of a tough situation.
And you mentioned to me before you got to the World Cup games.
Yes, and there's always upside in my life. You know, I've always been a cup half full kind of guy. So when I was managing the operations in Brazil remotely from Houston, because I was still looking after Alaska and other bits, and we knew the contract was coming up for renewal, and I talked to our client a couple of times. They said, we're just going to go out to bed, we're not going to renew. And I was really concerned about that because it was our life and blood in Brazil. So I asked them, I said, what do we need to demonstrate for you not to roll over the contract, to roll over the contract? They said, well, you need to be around more. And I was like, oh, okay. And we need to be able to negotiate the terms. I'm like, yeah, okay. So I spoke to my CEO at the time, David, and he said, Steve, what do you think you need to do? I said, I just need to go and live there. He went, well, get yourself packed up there.
Yeah.
So the reason we went down to live is because
to keep that contract.
And
would you have lost that contract, do you think, or?
I think we would have had to bid it, which would have made it very difficult for us to keep it because Brazilian companies would have bid it in a way that
you couldn't have competed.
Couldn't have competed. So thankfully, I had such a good relationship with Equinor, Statoil at the time, and we demonstrated we were improving. We weren't brilliant, but we were much better.
Yeah.
And by me going down and committed to going in and negotiating with them one-to-one, we rolled the contract over, but I knew I was staying for a while.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of changed the game down in Brazil for us down there. But once we'd renewed the contract, and I don't mean to be flipping, we had to change some things and we had to demonstrate improvement. But I knew I couldn't manage my other business out of Brazil.
Yeah.
You know, it would have been impossible. So at some point I realised that Brazil wasn't for us. So I had to decide what it looked like. And of course, from a company perspective, we were now Archer. We were a different organisation, and we had a downturn coming at us. And then the contract had been tightened, and I was like, man, I'm just babysitting a contract. I'm not adding any value here, apart from sitting around and meeting people and doing what I do and being close. So I got to a place where Mary Ann and I had a discussion, and I'd said, we just need to leave because they're not going to let us leave. Yeah. Unless we...
So you had to leave the company?
Well, I didn't. I just had to call it an ultimatum. And I don't like using that term, but it was a conscious decision. I just said to my CEO at the time, David, I said, look, I've watched what's happening with the company. I said, and we're struggling with HSE and different bits of the company we've bought and built. I said, and that's not acceptable. I said, and we don't have a director of HSE. It's managed by business unit. I said, but no one at corporate level was looking after HSE. And he said, and he actually got quite angry, and he didn't get angry often. He said, Steve, I'm responsible for HSE. That's my job. And I said, let's be fair. That's just another job you've got.
Yeah, you're running the business.
But you just haven't got the time or capacity to do it.
Yeah.
And he said, okay, so what are you suggesting? I said, I'll be your HSE director for the global company. I said, but I'm not doing it for Brazil. And he liked the idea. He said, get yourself on a plane and we'll talk about it. And I went up to Houston. We met for an hour and a half. And when we left that room, I'd already phoned down to Brazil and said, well, I need to find someone to replace me because we're moving back to Houston. So it was an ultimatum. I said I'd just find something else to do. It was more suited to where I thought my value was. Yeah. Or they could find something for me, or I could take up that position. And that's why we ended up back in Houston. A global role. And, you know, I knew that was a huge, huge position to fill. Yeah. I had thankfully I had the foresight to know that European operations were running pretty well because I knew who was in charge and I'd left a legacy there. I thought Brazil was a good place. I'd got some good resources. But I knew our West Texas stuff, our land stuff was just
Chaos.
dangerous and dangerous. And it was a reputational thing. And we're about to start operations in New Zealand, you know, it was like, oh God. And then the downturn was coming at the same time. So I think the first 3 months in Houston when I went back up, I remember saying to David, he said, because if you're in leadership positions and you're moving around, people judge you by your first 90 days. So you talk about your first 90 days. And I remember David, our CEO, sent me, said, Steve, what does your first 90 days look like? And I said, well, you won't see much of me. I'm going to where I think our biggest risks are. He went, but we've got no offshore operations here in the Gulf. I said, no, but we've got hundreds of rigs, pulling rigs, pumping rigs,
No,
West
donkeys.
Texas that were just bought from mom and pop companies. He said, so what are you saying? I said, I'm going west and I'll see you in a while. And he was like, really? I said, yeah. And that's what I did. I went to West Texas driving and that was an experience. You know, they were, if you've watched Landman,
Yeah.
it was Landman.
Yeah.
It was Landman, you know, and I couldn't believe it. And I'd turn up and I'd get to the site and there'd be someone in a little kiosk who was supposed to be security. And I'd say, I didn't announce myself. I just said, look, here I'm a HRC Director with the company. And yeah, okay, what do you want to do? I said, I want to see the rig manager. Oh, you think you'll find he's busy? I said, that's okay. And I'd introduce myself and the first thing I would do is say, you just need to shut down. And he's like, shut down? He said, yeah. He says, we were on day rate. I said, just shut down. I'm going to shut down for an hour and a half, 2 hours. I said, if you're not sure about that, just make a phone call, but we're shutting down. And I got them all in, as they call them, in trailers. And I talked about what was important to the company, what's important to me, my position and how I cared for them and I wanted to make things better for them. And they went from being like this to being like this to being...
Yeah, till they open, yeah.
And I think some of that is about Piper and my first-hand experience, but I think it's also demonstrating you actually care about it.
So how unsafe were some of the assets?
Oh, they probably didn't think they were unsafe. It was a cultural thing, right?
And was there accidents there? Like I watched Landman, there's a fucking accident every week.
Yeah. I mean, I remember one of the first sites I went to, and you're talking, if that's your drill floor and that's your bower, your rotary table, where the barrel is and where the next table next to us is today, somebody would be standing on Stilsons, tightening up a fishing tool that we're about to put down the hole.
Yeah.
How do you know what torque could set to and all the rest of it? It was just, and all the pickups would be no more than 30 yards away, and that would be their workshops.
Yeah.
I was like, this is just
insane.
so wild.
And what kind of changes do you implement to that then?
Well, you start with the basics, right? You've got to tell them to care, and you've got to tell them it will no longer tolerate them using hand tools or homemade tools, but we provide them with PPE to wear, not to take home. You know, but you start with the basics and you show you care, and you're prepared to ask. But I think what you have to be always ready to do, and this gets back to the steel on steel part I talked about, be open to being challenged.
So how long were you doing that? How long did you focus on the sort of west of Texas?
I think maybe I did my first month out there, and it was so, I use the term transformational, and sometimes I know I'm not kidding. When I came back after my first trip, and the way the offices were, David, the CEO's office, was in the middle, mine was at this side, and Ted, who was the operational VP, was at the other side.
Yeah.
And Ken, great guy, but he didn't believe I could make any difference out there because it was the Wild West.
Yeah.
And for him, he didn't like the idea that we had incidents, but he thought it would be difficult to change that. And I remember walking in and David said, how did it go? And I said, I thought it went really well. He goes, I'll tell you it went really well. He said, because they're talking about it. He said, give me an example. I said, well, by the time I got to the third rig site, he'd already shut down and they were in the trailer waiting for me.
Wow.
And Ted was like, what?
So how many sites was there?
Oh, I'd say 30, 40 maybe.
Wow. And they were spread all over, or kind of?
No, they were spread all over, but I didn't get to them all. And I remember having that conversation. Ted came into the office and he said, when are you going back out? I said, well, I'm going to tidy up my desk and do a couple of days work and then I'll think about it. And he goes, well, I need to know because I'm coming with you because I can't believe what's going on.
Yeah.
And I got a glowing reference from Ted when it all went south, when the we closed the corporate office in the US because the oil prices just cratered and we couldn't afford to operate.
Sustain it.
But I remember that glowing reference I got from Ted, and he said he's never, in his words, and he was very eloquent, but he didn't say much. And then words like, I would never have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes.
Yeah.
The difference in the culture.
What was the differences there for like the land rigging in west of Texas to North Sea?
Oh, uncomparable.
Just completely different.
Uncomparable.
Different industry almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, different industry. Land was treated as something completely different.
Yeah.
And whether that was because they thought they could run away from these things or they were smaller scale, because these rigs were rigged up and down in days.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. It was an interesting time.
And then you come back here and you end up exec a step change in safety. Was there a lot of, did you feel a lot of pressure in that role?
You know, it's funny because I didn't actually go actively looking for it. When I came back from Houston, I was thinking I was going to retire. Very young. I would have been very young at the time, probably in my late 50s. But I knew that would be a big ask. And then WellSafe were looking for an operations guy who had rig background.
Yeah.
I'd ran mobiles and
You were at WellSafe for about a year or so?
yeah, but so the commitment I made with Mark Patterson and Phil and Middle and these guys at WellSafe was I would get the first rig for them. I'd find a rig for them and I'd put it to work.
Yeah.
And that was my pure focus, you know, and I built up a good team around that, a support team. We eventually got the Guardian on board. Wouldn't have been the first choice, but I think it was the right choice at that time.
Yeah.
And then I attended a, I'm going to say it was a business breakfast. And I got talking to someone about step change. And they said, you do know they're looking for a new CEO or an executive director, they called it at the time. And I'm like, really? And they said, you'd be ideal. Is it something you'd be interested in? And I went home and I thought, you know, if I'm going to retire, I can't think of a better job to retire out of.
Yeah.
And then I went and met with Bob and Craig, who were the co-chairs at the time. And Bob Fennell and Craig Wiggins. It was an easy discussion because they were like, we need him. And I was
a good
mustard keen because I thought that would be a perfect way for me to go to retirement. But I didn't feel pressure at all. And then we signed up at the bottom line. I told Phil and he was disappointed, but he understood why I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And I had a vision in my head about what step change safety really needed to focus on. And I kind of started to make plans around that. And then just after we got going, and people were starting, because what I wanted to do was to re-engage, reignite. And I made some changes in the leadership team pretty quickly. I wanted to meet people face to face. And then COVID came in 2020, you know, and I'd only been in a year. And I was like, God, that's going to really hinder what's going on. So I had to go from being what I'd like to be as hands-on, visual, meet with people, to doing it remotely.
Yeah.
That was tough.
Yeah.
You know, and that's when we created the quarterly themes. And then I managed to get Norway to synchronise with us. And then I managed to get Australia to synchronise with us.
Yeah.
Because that's what I was all about. I was all about, this is not
Try to
a
get
UK
it together.
problem, this is a world problem.
Yeah.
So that was a big focus for me, was to start internationalising what we were doing at Step Change and Safety.
How easy was that to do?
I had good inroads into Norway because of my experience with Statoil and BP. So it was a pretty easy fix. Safer Together in Australia were slightly different. They had some opinions about what quarter should be where. And I said, yeah, but we're all talking about the same stuff. We just wanted it at the same time. And I explained why. And they were like, let's do it.
Yeah.
So it was great.
And obviously there's not been an accident in the North Sea for a while now. Do you think there's complacency setting in, or
I think
is the lack of anything happening seen as everything's good?
I think complacency is a tough word to use, but because it covers so many things. But I think we have a situation developing now where, rightly or wrongly, many companies are really tightening their belts.
Yeah.
They're probably pushing scopes down the road a bit further. They're maybe going and looking at a cessation of production quicker than they would have now. They're looking to divest.
Yeah.
And all these things add complications to an industry. And I think we're in a place where we really need to think about the competence we've retained in our industry. And I've said this to most talks I do will refer to, I think we are depleting our competence quicker than we're building it.
And is that something you're working at Fortitude then? That
Fortitude Action Beyond Compliance is an interesting creation. And you may think it was something that I dreamt up as a means to remain employed in my latter years. However, it was actually something that my wife created, Mary Ann. Mary Ann is a professional HRC person in her second, if not third career, and she was offshore as a medic, and she became an HRC advisor and supervisor for some of the biggest companies in this world. And when we came back from Brazil, she'd been developing competency systems to keep her occupied while we worked in Brazil. And she had been contacted by an organisation and asked if she'd be interested in becoming involved in the follow-up to Grenfell, that tragic tower fire that killed so many people. And she found it she was curious, and she got the spec of the job, and she just thought, that's something I really want to be getting into. She was passionate around it. She had to work as a consultant, so she had to create a company, and that's where Fortitude Action Beyond Compliance came from. Now, the Fortitude part was fairly easy for her because she has some Scottish heritage. I have absolutely Scottish heritage. And Fortitude, which is effectively courage, is in both our clan heraldry. So it made perfect sense for us Raes, in my words, and her family line, Shaws, to come together and create Fortitude. And she wasn't done with just being courageous. She wanted people to be courageous. She wanted us to have a courageous company. She actually gave thought to the action beyond compliance part. And for us, in particular for Mary Ann, and I believed in it also, but it was her company she was creating, she believed that the standards that are set by our regulators for us to comply with were a pretty low bar. And they weren't, some may argue, that difficult to realise. But I think if you're only aiming for a bar that is low, your performance will be low. And she believed the same. So she created Action Beyond Compliance because she recognised she had to do something different, or encourage people to do something different beyond compliance. And if you think about the whole safety case regime that was created after Piper, it was about goal setting. It was about setting your own standards as high as you thought were applicable for your business, and setting your own KPIs and demonstrating how you met compliance. And we now both encourage companies to stretch themselves and go beyond compliance, create actions beyond compliance. And I think what we do at Fortitude is about actions beyond compliance. We don't talk about complying with processes or procedures. We talk about company culture. We talk about a means to improve company culture at a holistic level. And I think that's what we are becoming known for in Fortitude Action Beyond Compliance. So when I gave up full-time work at Step Change and Safety, I was genuinely thinking I was retiring, and that was never going to be the case. I thought a sharp shock stop would not be suitable for me. And actually some of the larger companies that operate in this sector wanted to engage with me to have insight and for me to do leadership talks, etc. for them. So I chose to work through Fortitude Action Beyond Compliance as well, because it fitted our business model. And I think if I think about what we do at Fortitude Action Beyond Compliance, we don't talk about processes, we talk about culture. And we've created I'll call it a suite of talks and reenactments that are all about choices and consequences. And I think rather than trying to encourage people to meet their own standards, etc., and so forth, because we didn't want this to be a really, really full-on engagement with companies, we created something that gives you, what I would say, it revisited some of the more tragic events in our lives, and it ties in with my managerial experience. And what does that look like? It looks like an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, and the whole purpose of the talks, the keynote talks that I certainly deliver, are around not that trying to get you to remember everything I've learned, but to remember how you feel when you leave one of my talks. Because it's about how we feel. It makes us change our behaviour. And I think that's the essence of what we try and do at Fortitude, Action Beyond Compliance, is to re-baseline people's awareness of what a bad day at the office looks like, and also what is important around how you build a strong safety culture. And we talk about 6 things. We talk about commitment at a leadership level and a workforce level. We talk about management of change. We talk about control of work. We talk about competence, complacency, and communication. And you probably will find you've got many processes and procedures in your suite of manuals to control those things in your organizations. However, we don't talk at that level. We talk about a holistic level, which is about how you feel and how you build strong teams that honor and try and adhere to delivering on those 6 elements. And it's all about how you feel. And if you change how people feel, their behaviors will change. So we have a simple model that seems to be effective, and it keeps me employed even though I'm trying to retire.
So what about this industry then? So you get guys who go into their offshore survival and then probably, touch wood, never have to use it. But if they did, it could be years and years gone by. Where's the compliance there? And what's the situation with the training that we got in this industry then? Do you think that's fit for purpose?
Well, regarding modern day training standards that are still in place prior to going offshore, do I still think they're effective and applicable? I think they're absolutely applicable. Are they as effective as they were back in the day? Post-Piper, I think we've really not done a good job at continuing the authenticity or the fidelity around training. And I say that because I think what we do now, and I think I'm talking through experience, because I've done now 10 offshore survival full courses over the space of nearly 40 years. And I can tell you the first 2 I did, in particular, the first one I did, it was like going to a theme park. There was flashing lights, there was darkness, there was waves, there was hoses turned on, and you were jumping from a platform, had to turn over a life raft. It felt you were going into spaces that had actual, not artificial smoke. They had real smoke in them. These were really authentic and high fidelity experiences. And I knew when I sat those courses, despite being excited as a young 20-something-year-old, we just knew they were important for us to pass. And our training coaches at the time were very rigorous, and they made sure we completed these courses to the best of our ability. And you really felt when you left that course, you were in a better position to respond should there be an emergency offshore. If I fast forward that 40 years I talk about, and I've done these courses in different countries as well, when they're all APITO registered. But what I would say now is we've really compressed so much in a short period of time, and I think we've lost sight of what these courses are actually about. They're supposed to prepare you to respond to an emergency and be able to competently muster, get in a lifeboat and evacuate a platform should, God forbid, you ever need to do that. I don't think we do that very well now. We may think the training elements are very good. I think the competence assurance following that are pretty poor. It's a very low bar. I think I've been on courses where I've heard tutors coaching with the right answers to get people out of the establishment in time to catch a bus or a train or a plane home. And I don't think that sets the right tone, and I certainly don't think it sets you up for success should something like this happen. So I think we could do a lot more. And I think my main concern is around, if you talk to young green hands who are trying to get into this industry, they're not sitting their body at course to learn how to escape from an emergency or respond to an emergency. They're actually trying to get tickets to access offshore work. And we've completely flipped what is really important about what we do in our safety training. So as much as I think our training is still very good, I think the way we go about competence assurance and validation is pretty poor. Is there things we could do about that? I absolutely believe there is. If you've been to any of my talks, I talk passionately around competence assurance because I think it's something that we're not particularly strong at in this industry. And I think that's because it's difficult to have competence assurance at site because it's seen as an extra bed, it's seen as an extra cost, it's an individual that's got to be trained and qualified to do competence assurance certification. Yet all the technology exists almost in place for us to carry out these competence assurance validations from this table, from a validated competence assessor. We have tools such as body cameras, insight visors, audio, visual support tools that we can use at the worksite. And the same assessor sitting in an office with the correct technology and access could be validating people in 3 or 4 different installations every day in different bits of this world, are just in the North Sea. That's an efficient competency assurance model. I think we've lost sight of that, and I think, again, we just assume that the training, yes, it's repeated every 4 years, I think it is, for a refresher is good enough. And I'm not just referring to emergency escape training, I'm referring to competence per se in technical elements, whether you're a mechanic, an electrician, a rope access guy. You can be verified offshore from onshore much more cost effectively and efficiently than you could in the days when I was back offshore. So we have some work to do. I just wish we could do that, and I think that's something I really try to push for during my talks. We're offshore, so we're still far better than we were when I was offshore in the 1980s, but the ball's slipping, and I think our core competency levels offshore are being diluted quicker than we're building it, because as a result of the loss of jobs, people retiring at my age, it takes years to build good, strong, competent teams, and we're not giving that time or investment to do that.
Even here, like we went to a training centre in Houston, and obviously the only thing you see here, people doing their bosy, they get the survival, their suits on and everything else, and then you go there and they go offshore in their jeans. They don't have the full body suit or anything. So it's even there, miles apart. Miles apart.
And it's not that the US haven't had their pipe and offers. They've had their Deepwater Horizon. They still continue to have
many issues. Yeah.
But where's your tolerance level?
Yeah, different
where's your
mindset almost.
Tolerance level, yeah.
And going back to leadership, you mentioned you've done the MBA and stuff like that, and you've obviously been VP of various big, massive drilling companies. What's your style as far as leading people, driving culture?
So for me, I like to think people that I've been directly been their manager will have had a different experience because I'm so hands-on. And I think I like to, some people may not support this, and that's okay, but I think I take the good advice I got from one of my managers about steel on steel, which is about 2 people getting together and really challenging each other and listening for the better of good, And I think that's what I'd like to think I do, because, as I said to you before, I'm far more operationally astute now than I was when I was a young manager. But I was willing to learn, and I was willing to be open enough to admit that I wasn't all-encompassing.
Right, yeah.
And I think that's what hopefully people will remember. And again, I get back to the point, and I've heard it through a couple of your sessions with other people. Surround yourself with people who are very competent at what they do, but have also got the same
mindset,
people skills. And never be afraid to get people reporting to you or close to you who are potentially looking for your job. Because you can't move in an organisation unless you backfill. So I've always thought that when I've moved, that
somebody's been ready.
I've been ready or very close to ready. And the other thing I think I really valued was having a very strong HR director. Someone that's in your people side, who thinks like you and recognises what is important for you in your business, and then that really just take care of a lot of things.
And then you were also, again, for all these senior level positions within the industry, you're also chairman of the Pound for Piper charity. So how did that come about, and how is that important to you? Away from just being a survivor of it, but...
So, one of the ladies that started Pound for Piper in 2013, Carol Stewart, that's not her married name, but that's her name. She brought 4 doors from me,
right?
Same age as me, roughly. So I had an affiliation with Carol all my life.
And what was her relation to the disaster?
Her relation to the disaster was she was an offshore stewardess.
Okay.
And she saw the impact directly on other rigs.
Yeah.
Not Piper, but other rigs.
People who knew people and everything.
And she recognised that what the gardens were supposed to be had fell away.
Yeah.
And
So who came up with the gardens plan in the first place? Was that Aberdeen City Council?
No, the gardens were an interesting development that I didn't get involved in because I was in my don't want to be there phase. But there were a group of bereft widows. I can't remember them all. I know the Ballantynes were involved, Pat and Bob Ballantyne were involved, so were other people. And they'd approached the council about having a memorial garden or a memorial statue. And the council were already developing the Rose Garden as an extension to the one that's up there.
Okay.
To the Queen Mother one. And I think they were given 2 sites. One was central and one was up at Hazelhead. And the agreement was they would take the Hazelhead one and they would have the monument erected in there. So that's how that came to be. And the council were just supposed to look after it.
Yeah.
But like most things, it's about a balance of priorities, right, and all the rest of it. And it was coming up to one of the most significant anniversaries, 2013. And the gardens were looking shockingly poor. And Carol and another couple of ladies, Lucy and Pat initially, I don't think she stuck the whole journey, and Sean Liddell got involved. And they pushed it through and they did the fundraising and they raised enough money to get the gardens turned around by shaming people almost to do it.
Okay.
And then Carol had done that and they were selling merchandise and all the rest of it. And we got to a place where I had came back in 2018 and I remember going to an event, an OE UK event maybe, or a Piper event, and Pound for Piper had a stall and Carol was on it.
Yeah.
And I always give Carol a hug and went up and thanked her for what they're doing. And she said, would you like to be a trustee? And I'm like, well, I need to think about that. I said, because am I doing it just because I'm a survivor, or am I doing it because I can add value? And then I met with Sean and we kind of decided that the right thing to do would be to take a burden off of Carol, you know, and from a manager's perspective, you know, add in some business acumen to see what we could do.
Yeah.
So it felt right for me to do it. And I think it still feels right, although it's challenging. And I recognise you folks as well did your bit with the Monopoly games and all the rest of it, which I think was great. Some people weren't for it. I was absolutely for it.
I think people misunderstood what it was. I remember being the front page of the fucking Evening Express, the Press and Journal one day, and I thought, what the fuck have I done?
Yeah.
And they because we hadn't even, Hasbro hadn't even printed the game yet.
Yeah.
And they had, I don't know where they got the picture, but they'd created a picture and then they'd spoke to another survivor. I don't remember his name, but I think he was in Ayrshire or something like that, Kilmarnock way. And the Press and Journal had told him, these guys are making a game, basically, you know, I don't know, the rig goes on fire, go to jail. And it's like, it couldn't be any further from what it was. Thankfully, because that day, because I was shitting myself, because I thought, some of the companies who have paid to make this board
are going to go, no.
If they pull out of this now, I'm fucked.
They're saddled.
Yeah. But thankfully the company supported it. And I remember getting a phone call, I don't know if it was for Sean, and he said, oh, CNR have just made a donation of £10,000 a day. So even the article, though it wasn't spot on, actually raised money for the Pound for Piper. So everything it turned out quite good. My problem was we had no clue what we were doing. And we told people to make a donation of £35 and they would get a board. But then people made all these donations, but then we didn't have anybody's address. We couldn't fucking send them the boards. Yeah. So we ended up with hundreds of boards still that people had paid for. But people's thing was more about making the donation to the Pound for Piper rather than the actual Monopoly board. So,
and I think we did a good job with yourselves and us to get most of them out.
Yes.
And I think that's what I would say. We still had quite a...
But it raised really good money.
And awareness. It created numbers and awareness. And I think that's an important thing. But I think, Kenny, you experienced what I've experienced with the gardens is for every positive, someone's got a negative.
There's a negative.
You know, and I think if you put yourself in the frame, be prepared.
Yeah,
you know,
or try running a golf club.
And so when I created a vision for what I thought the gardens could look like as a refurbish, and I looked at it from a very holistic business point of view, saying, okay, they need to be cheaper to maintain. They need to be more attractive to the public all year round. Yeah. They need to be more accessible, and they need to be worth going to visit. Yeah. But they can't affect the monument itself. And I went in with that, and the rest of the trustees, we'd got a couple of options, and we thought we'd came up with a concept that was incredible. And I did the press launch up at Hazelhead Cafe, and we invited the press, we invited supporters, and it was an overwhelming success. And I was flying out the next day to go somewhere else. Yeah. And the naysayers got a hold of it, and it
And that
became
was
an
it.
absolute train wreck. And a public petition with names that were generated from people that didn't understand what was going on had 5,000 names before you blink an eye.
Yeah.
And then the thing that really made it, compounded that, was the council changed at the same time. So we went from a very empathetic, supportive council
Yeah.
to a council that knew nothing about it,
Yeah.
who were afraid because they just accepted a petition to say it couldn't go ahead.
Yeah.
And that was a train wreck. And if Mary Ann's mental health was stretched by it, I'm thankfully a bit more resilient and stuck with it. But things like that, when you're doing it for a social good cause,
Yeah.
they're not easy to deal with.
There's
Now,
just a lack of understanding for people in it, because they don't know what's involved.
I think it's almost more basic than that. It's a fear of change.
Yeah.
And now we find ourselves in a place where we want to do something, but the council own the gardens, and they really want, this is the part you'll get because of what you did with the games, but they want to go to consultation,
Yeah.
but they've got no idea who to consult with, because there's not a list that says, here's the people that's affected by Piper,
Yeah.
or here's the people that lost people. You know,
You would think you would get support for the local community.
I think we had
like
that. I
yeah.
think we had that already. I have a private WhatsApp group, Facebook group with many who lost
People, family
husbands and
members.
fathers and some survivors. And they were all, what a great idea. They're on it because we shared stuff with them.
Yeah.
And then when it broke, it only took a couple of individuals to really create
This destroys it.
created a wasp nest. You know, and I think that's the sad part. So now the council are and will be scared to do anything because they think someone's going to kick off.
Yeah.
And it leaves us in a precarious position that
Stupidity.
we'll deal with. We'll deal with it. But hey, as I said, for every positive, constructive person, there's someone that's just ready to shoot you down.
And if you go back to, or you speak to Steve Rae, who's 19, or maybe one of your grandchildren, what would be your advice to them? Would you advise them to get involved in oil and gas?
Well, I think about my 5 boys, and I remember as they were growing up thinking, I'm going to have that conversation about them. And what I said to my boys, and I'd said to my grandkids as well, actually, is, look, you need to make your own decisions, but you need to make them from an informed point of view.
Yeah.
I said, and what I'd said to my boys actually was, if you would really think you want to work offshore, because most of them did, I said, I can't stop you because it's your decision, but I'll inform you of what you might be facing.
Yeah.
And I want to know the name of the company you think you're going to work for, because then I might have a different opinion.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with the 5 boys. And only one of the boys had an offer from a company that told me he was not going to work for them. He's just not going to work
What
for
was the issue with them?
I didn't believe they were a safe company.
Okay.
I genuinely didn't believe they were a safe company. But that same company changed out their entire senior management group at corporate level. And I knew the guy went in to become CEO, and within 3 years he turned it around. And my son went to work for that company.
Is that a global company or an Aberdeen?
They're a global company. It's now part of another global company
Okay,
because
yeah.
of acquisition and
Amalgamation,
mergers and all that. But I think that was, for me, I remember telling the chap, it was the CEO, I won't give you his name, that where I'd been with my son and how he couldn't work for that company, and now I'd happily watch him go to that company.
Final question, we're in a bar. If you were to sit here and have a drink with somebody or a couple of people, who would that be?
Well, the 2 people I would love to sit in a bar with is my father and James C. Day, who was the CEO of Noble Drilling for most of my time there. And those 2 people had a profound impact on how I am today. And I think when I left Noble Drilling, spun off the platform business in 2008, I continued to go and have dinner with James C. Day right up until the time I left Houston. After he'd retired and all the rest of it, we just enjoyed each other's company. And I think he was a good example of steel on steel. Very knowledgeable, eloquent man, cared immensely for people, but was always ready to listen and be empathetic to what you had to say, and he would give you his pearls of wisdom, which was fantastic. And because I lost my dad so young, I often think about what would he have thought of we've done as 5 siblings, and did we do a good enough job looking after his wife, our mother? And I don't doubt he would be proud of the 5 of us, but it would be just good to share that with him.
Brilliant, Steve.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.